From the remove of an unused free-floating toroid, an unsightly pharaoh checking progress on a deformed sphinx, the Panparol surveyed this vista of cerebrospinal toil that was pre-reminiscent of the great Russian constructivists, clatter-smash tinkling itself to near unconsciousness while doing so. The uproar of construction, for a time, drowned out the Panparol's glass gasps of self-inflicted ecstasy, and even masked the gradually increasing background rumble. Meanwhile, space-time elsewhere carried on as normal, getting bigger, ticking through its femto lifespan, vomiting its careless, ceaseless prodigies and permutations. Brobdingnagian harps, trilobites, cooling towers and anchor bouquets were amongst the only nameable components of this ongoing eruption into form, at least from a modern perspective. It need not be said that all of these spontaneously generated shapes were much more interesting and magnificent than the distressing effigy that the brain workforce was then in the process of erecting, a sideshow exhibit in a jar, displayed in company with masterpieces. Finally, the Panparulium was finished, to the satisfaction of the Panparol alone. So pleased was the eponymous dictator/deity by the dimensions of this loathsome idol, that it failed to notice how the quiff tip of the graven image was turned inwards, pleasuring itself. This subtle touch, the Panparol forever wanking at the alleged centre of the universe, had been devised by an increasingly resentful Glyn, and executed by the deputy director's phonetically sympathetic cohort, Glit, Glig, Glimp and Glock, that last of which chose to identify as an entirely different vowel sound. As the Proto-University's first term commenced, Glyn's clique looked on with carefully suppressed amusement as the influx of collegiate brains filed solemnly into the multi-oriented auditorium beneath a semblance of their demiurge captured eternally in flagrant self-abuse. This paleo-academic era, while it lasted, was largely congenial, aggressively erudite and crushingly monotonous. This was because the Panparulium employed only one lecturer and taught only one subject, that being thermoneverdynamics. Worse, the single lecturer appeared not to have fully thought this self-invented theory through, and offered only a few heavily opinionated anecdotes in its support. Chief amongst these was the oft-repeated notion that the rumbling, by now loud enough to render many of the lectures unintelligible, was merely an aftershock being all that it could be in a universe of everlasting self-improvement. Typically, the Panparol would make a rambling presentation of these same ideas over and over, followed by the customary session of questions and answers, before calling for a recess. These break periods, during which socialising and inevitably much clatter-smash tinkling were allowed, were demarcation points as critical as dawn or dusk in that unvarying bluish-pink continuum. They were also the only thing that made the academic life remotely bearable, all that prevented more of the assembled students from becoming restless and politically radical than there already were. Glyn could not help but notice that the frequent calls for recess offered ample opportunity for the sole lecturer's philandering amongst the student body, many of whom seemed inordinately flattered by their creepy principal's advances. There would regularly be a dozen or so scholars that competed for the Panparol's attention, always floating in those spaces closest to the lectern, teasing up their sensory extensions into ever more outrageous styles and flirting openly in the question and answer intervals. They made Glyn sick with their pretended understanding of and interest in thermoneverdynamics, their sycophantic tittering each time the Panparol attempted an ellipsoid joke. Apparently it only knew the one, this being a display of something stupid, actual or invented, that Glyn was reputed to have done. In fact, the Glyn joke, in its many variations, had become so widespread that a number of the students had suggested glassy dissertations on the subject, their preposterous sound library voices ringing in the Panparulium's deranged acoustics. During recess periods, the Panparol would make itself available for one-on-one tuition with whichever simpering cerebellum had been fluttering their cilia most invitingly, these episodes invariably taking place off-campus, usually in the vicinity of the leftover levitating donuts. On one such occasion, Glyn suggested that the eager-to-please Glock should follow lecturer and student to establish the validity of these extracurricular excursions. Unsurprisingly, when the culturally appropriative hanger-on reported back to what it called its vowlies, Glyn, Glit, Glig, Glimp and Company would shudder visibly whenever Glock used this expression. It regurgitated a long-lens ellipsoid image of the Panparol lewdly frolicking with glee, and coincidentally, with glee. Off on the so-called dark side of the nearest hovering toroidal lump, master and pupil made the beast with two brains. Endlessly repeated in Glock's paparazzi loop, the Panparol and Glee entwined their spinal tails as an obscene caduceus, mashing their hairy fascinators one against the other in delirious abandon. With a hardening hippocampus, Glyn gazed coldly at this pitiful and grubby assignation, the unsightly older brain making a fool of itself with the squeaking juvenile. Glyn didn't excrete so much as a single cut-glass word, but all of its companions, even Glock, knew that the second-in-command was both resentful and humiliated, 42 and 50. Glyn was literally bristling. It was a story as old as time, which was to say, less than a femtosecond. The inevitable confrontation happened at the start of summer term, although in accordance with the principles of thermoneverdynamics, they were all summer terms. The rumbling sound was so pronounced by this point that the bulbous declarations of the panprawl were necessarily the size of glass dirigibles in order to be heard above the thunderous reverberations. The bore of the Pamprulium's entrance tunnels had been widened so that these spent conversation globules could more easily be swept into the outer void by students made to serve as boltzmann janitors, yet still the garrulous detritus tended to accumulate in corners of the multiplanar auditorium, shimmering and jingling unappealingly. The panprawl had just concluded a meandering account of how thermoneverdynamics implied that the classic Glynn joke would just keep on getting funnier and funnier the more it was repeated, then called for a session of questions and answers, with its furry censor lecherously pointed at the giggling front-row students. It was here that Glynn and a tail-picked team of phonetic cronies made their entrance, shimmying into position between lecturer and audience with cerise suds everywhere. In the immediate apprehensive silence, while the panprawl contracted its receptacone into a perplexed squint, Glynn volunteered a carefully considered question. For whom can this perpetually improving universe be said to be improving? The panprawl, taken aback by Glynn's inquiry, blustered a long stream of floating ornaments to the effect that space-time was continually getting better from its own perspective, and that surely this must be the same for everyone and everything. Aware that this could be seen as a flimsy argument, the panprawl fell back on the increasingly loud rumble as supporting evidence, then ended with a flourish of arch rhetoric by asking if Glynn had a more convincing theory. Glee, Glam, Gloop and all the other fawning teachers' pets were tittering already at their tutor's classic put-down and agreeing that this ill-planned intervention took the whole Glynn joke to the next level, when the deputy brain dipped its velvet prong in an affirming nod. Yes, I believe I have. It seems to me that this existence, far from constantly improving on perfection, is in no small measure getting worse. As evidence, I too would cite the mounting volume of the rumbling noise that makes our discourse pointless and inaudible, that forces us to cough up speeches like translucent zeppelins. How does this, in any sense, improve our situation? Reeling from this heresy, its sense aperture hanging slack with disbelief, the panprawl here accidentally loaned weight to Glynn's proposal by exclaiming, "What?" in audio-visual bubbles now inflected with a heavily ironic tone.
We buy and sort your unwanteds for you. Send them to Vintage Cash Cow.
Ironic tone, Glynn condescendingly reprised those opening remarks, then went on to make matters worse by calling into doubt the customary